My name is John Miller, and I have been working as a ranger in the Appalachian Mountains Park for 5 years. This place, with its endless forests, winding trails, and ancient trees, has become my second home. My life was completely different before I came here. I used to live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and worked as an occupational safety specialist at the U.S. Steel plant. My job was to ensure compliance with all safety rules and regulations in the workplace. Every day, I conducted inspections, wrote reports, trained employees on proper equipment handling, and ensured there were no accidents at the plant. The work was important but monotonous, and it suffocated me. Since childhood, I had loved hiking, fishing, and camping, but city life and daily hustle gradually pushed these hobbies to the background. One day, everything changed. My close friend died in a workplace accident, and it made me reassess my priorities. I realized that life was too short to spend on something you don't love. I decided to quit my job and drastically change my life. I remembered how my friend and I had dreamed of living and working in the mountains. That's how I came to the idea of becoming a ranger. The path to my new profession was not easy. I enrolled in ranger school in Marshall, North Carolina. The training lasted 2 years and included many theoretical and practical lessons. We studied forestry, biology, ecology, safety rules, and first aid. I learned to navigate the terrain, build fires in any conditions, and recognize animal tracks. One of the most memorable moments was completing the survival course. We were sent into the forest for a week with minimal gear. It was a real test of endurance. We built shelters, foraged for food and water, and protected ourselves from the weather and wild animals. It was then that I realized this was not just a job, but a way of life that required total dedication and a love for nature. After completing the course, I received my certification and started looking for a job. The park in the Appalachian Mountains was the perfect place for me. Here I found what I was looking for: tranquility, the grandeur of nature, and the opportunity to be useful. Being a ranger is not as romantic as it might seem at first glance. It's not just walks in the woods and talking to tourists. It's the responsibility for people's safety, maintaining order in the park, and conducting rescue operations. Despite all the difficulties, I feel I'm in the right place. Every morning, when I see the sun breaking through the treetops, hear the birds singing, and breathe in the fresh mountain air, I know I made the right choice. However, there's more to these mountains than just natural beauty. Hidden among the ancient forests are secrets that are not often spoken about, and one of them is about to become my reality. One early morning, I set out on my regular patrol. At this time, there were few tourists in the park, but we rangers always keep a close watch on the territory. Nature was just beginning to wake up. The sun barely touched the treetops. A gentle mist covered the ground, and the air was fresh and cool. This was my favorite time of day. I walked along the familiar trail that led through the dense forest. My steps were almost silent thanks to the soft carpet of moss and fallen leaves. I listened to the sounds of nature: birds singing, leaves rustling, and the faint scurrying of small animals. My route started from the small ranger cabin where we usually gather for morning briefings and passed through several key points in the park. It was important to check all the trails, signs, and rest areas to ensure they were in order. I periodically stopped to carefully inspect each area, looking for any signs of trouble or the presence of intruders. After about half an hour, I noticed something unusual. On the side of the trail, in the loose soil, there were strange tracks. They were large and deep, clearly left by something or someone heavy. I crouched down to examine them more closely. The tracks didn't resemble those I was used to seeing. They weren't bear, deer, or even wolf prints. There was something sinisterly wrong about them. A mix of curiosity and caution washed over me. I decided to follow these tracks, hoping to find out who or what had left them. The tracks led deeper into the forest, veering off the main trail into wild, little explored areas of the park. I moved carefully, trying not to make any noise and keeping the tracks in sight. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the surroundings grew darker. The trees here grew thicker, their canopies interwoven, creating an illusion of perpetual twilight. The sunlight barely pierced through the dense foliage, and the shadows seemed to come alive around me. A few more minutes passed, and I suddenly realized that the tracks had become even stranger. They now had deep scratches, as if the creature that made them had enormous claws. My heart started to beat faster. I continued following the tracks, cautiously advancing through the thick forest. Each step was a struggle, as roots and rocks hidden under the moss and leaves became more frequent. Soon, I emerged into a small clearing and froze at the sight of an abandoned tourist camp. Tents were scattered around, some of them torn as if by a forceful attack. Clothes and gear were strewn everywhere, left behind in what appeared to be a hurry. Pots still hung over a long dead fire pit, with cold ashes reminding me that no one had been here for a while. I approached closer, carefully examining the camp. At first glance, it seemed like the tourists had simply left, abandoning their things, but on closer inspection I noticed several oddities. First, the entire camp was covered in a red powder scattered everywhere. I took a bit on my finger and cautiously sniffed it. It wasn't ash or pollen. It was something artificial but unknown to me. Second, I found a piece of torn red fabric caught in branches near one of the tents. The fabric was soft, as if it was part of a robe. Everything looked as if there had been a struggle here, but there were no traces of blood. I tried to use my radio to contact my colleagues and report the find, but it wasn't picking up a signal. The dense forest and the distance from the main trail were clearly causing reception problems. I tried changing my position, raising the radio higher, but it didn't help. The signal was completely lost. Looking at the tracks again, I noticed that there were more of them now. Some were clearly human, bare feet, boot prints, but next to them were those strange tracks that had led me here. It was more than just random prints. The tracks went in one direction, as if something or someone had been chasing the people, and they were running in panic. I continued through the forest, carefully following the tracks that were becoming less distinct, disappearing into the thick vegetation. Around me was a deafening silence, broken only by the rustling leaves underfoot and occasional sounds of forest dwellers. But from time to time I heard strange noises, as if someone was rustling branches or quietly growling. These sounds were odd, unlike usual forest noises, and it made me uneasy. For a moment I thought about turning back. My intuition screamed of danger, and my mind suggested retreat. But I couldn't leave the tourists in trouble if they were still somewhere nearby. The responsibility for their lives outweighed my fear. I continued forward, hoping to find them and understand what had happened here. Soon I reached a river. Its quiet murmur somewhat calmed my nerves. The water was clear and cool, reflecting the sunlight that broke through the treetops. The tracks led along the bank, and I decided to follow them, carefully stepping along the rocky edge of the river. The water quietly splashed against my boots, creating an illusion of temporary peace. I walked along the river, listening to every sound and carefully surveying the surroundings. After some distance, I found myself in a wide gorge. By the river was a large sandy shore, as if someone had deliberately cleared this area. On the sandy shore, I saw a strange circle of stones. The stones were laid out evenly, forming a perfect circle about 2 meters in diameter. In the center of the circle was a layer of the same red powder I had seen at the camp. This place looked like some sort of ritual site. Nearby, I noticed another detail: a piece of a red-hooded robe discarded on the ground. It seemed as though the robe had been left there in a hurry. Carefully examining the area, I noticed bloodstains. They were scattered, as if someone had been wounded and tried to move, leaving bloody marks behind. The blood led to some bushes, where I found another piece of the red robe. It became clear that something terrible and inexplicable had happened here. Everything around me resembled a scene from a nightmare. The forest silence, the strange tracks, and the sinister stone circle created an atmosphere of tense anticipation. My heart was beating faster, and my thoughts were racing. I felt like I was on the verge of uncovering something horrifying, but at the same time, I wanted to run away, far from this place. Gathering my courage, I decided to go further. I needed to understand what had happened and where the tourist had gone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and followed the bloodstains leading deeper into the forest. My instincts screamed of danger, but I couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. Suddenly, the sky began to darken. The sun, which had been lighting up the forest just moments ago, seemed to vanish behind a dense curtain of clouds. The wind picked up, cold and piercing, filling the air with an eerie rustling of leaves. Everything around plunged into a foreboding twilight, and I felt panic rising in my chest. I suddenly heard a rustling in the bushes. Turning around, I saw something creeping towards me. At first, I couldn't make out any details, but gradually, the figure became more distinct. It was a large creature with massive clawed paws and eyes glowing in the dark. It moved silently, like a shadow, approaching me with terrifying confidence. Horror gripped me. Realizing I needed to escape, I turned and ran. The forest turned into a maze of dark shadows and intertwining branches. I stumbled over tree roots, struggling through the dense underbrush. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, mixed with the noise of the wind and the sinister rustling coming from the creature chasing me. I could feel it getting closer. From time to time, I glanced back and saw its silhouette flickering between the trees, drawing ever nearer. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging, pushing me to move faster. Branches whipped at my face, but I ignored the pain, focusing solely on escaping. The run seemed endless. The forest seemed to close in around me, hindering my escape. I jumped over a stream, descended a steep slope, and found myself in thick woods again. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a strange place, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the deepening twilight, I noticed a tree to which the tourists were tied. It was not an ordinary tree. Its trunk was wide and gnarled, as if woven from numerous intertwined roots and branches. The bark was blackened like chard, with red veins running through it, resembling streams of lava. The tree exuded a sinister aura, and it seemed to be alive, watching the proceedings. The faces of the tourists were pale with fear, their eyes glistening with tears and terror. They were tied with thick ropes that looked ancient, with frayed knots. Surrounding the tree were statues of wolves, carved from wood and stone. These statues were incredibly detailed, with bared fangs and fierce eyes, staring straight ahead. Around these statues stood people in red hooded robes, their faces hidden. They were engaged in a strange ritual, their hands raised to the sky, emitting monotonous, ominous chants. Their voices blended into a single chorus, and the air around seemed to vibrate with this inhuman melody. I realized they were summoning something dark and dangerous. And then, as if on command, a huge werewolf emerged from the depths of the forest. It was incredibly tall, with a muscular body covered in thick gray fur. Its eyes glowed with a yellow light, and the claws on its paws were long and sharp like daggers. At first glance, it seemed wild and uncontrollable, but something in its movements betrayed a state of trance. It moved slowly, as if under someone's control. The werewolf approached the bound tourists, and I saw their fear intensify. Under the sound of the chanting hooded figures, its movements became more confident and purposeful. I noticed that each of its steps matched the rhythm of their chant, as if it were a puppet in the hands of these cultists. My heart sank as I realized I was witnessing something unimaginably horrifying. I tried to think of what to do next. The tourists were in mortal danger, and there was no time to ponder. But my head was spinning with fear, and my body seemed paralyzed with terror. The werewolf stopped a few steps away from the bound people. Its gaze was fixed on them, and its mouth opened, revealing long fangs. The chanting grew louder, and the tension in the air reached its peak. I realized they were truly summoning something, perhaps darkness itself, to inhabit this creature and complete the ritual. I knew I had to do something. My mind screamed to flee, but my heart and conscience wouldn't let me abandon these people in distress. I took a deep breath, gathering all my strength and determination, preparing to act. At that moment, I realized that my entire life had led me to this moment, and the fate of those in mortal danger depended on my choice. The creature was almost upon the victims, its fangs glistening in the dim light, and the tourists were struggling helplessly against their bonds. I knew I had to act immediately. I spotted a large rock at my feet and, taking aim, hurled it at one of the cultists. The rock hit him in the head with a dull thud, and he collapsed to the ground. The chanting stopped, and the werewolf slowed its approach, as if suddenly coming to its senses. The remaining cultists continued to chant, their voices growing louder, trying to regain control over the creature. I quickly scanned the area and noticed a thick branch nearby, sturdy enough to use as a club. Grabbing it, I rushed to the nearest cultist and struck him on the head with all my might. He too fell, his chant cut short. Chaos erupted. The werewolf, having lost control, suddenly awoke and furiously attacked the remaining cultists. They screamed in panic, trying to defend themselves, but the huge beast was too strong and fast. A bloody massacre unfolded right before my eyes, and I realized this was my chance to save the tourists. I ran to the tree where 3 tourists were tied and took out the knife I always carried with me. Quickly and carefully, I cut the ropes, freeing them one by one. The tourists, 2 men and 1 woman, were trembling with fear, but I reassured them. "Run while you have the chance," I said, helping them to their feet. We started running through the forest, leaving behind the chaos and screams. The werewolf, meanwhile, continued to attack the cultists, tearing them apart. We pushed through the dense thicket, trying not to stop or look back. We ran through the forest without paying attention to the path. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tangled our feet, but fear drove us forward. The tourists I had freed were exhausted, but the terror propelling them gave them strength. Behind us, heavy footsteps and the growl of the werewolf pursuing us echoed. We dared not look back, knowing that this creature would not stop until it had its prey. Hearts pounded wildly, breaths came in gasps, but we couldn't stop for even a second. The forest was dark, and it seemed that the trees closed in around us tighter with each step. From time to time, I heard the werewolf getting closer, its eerie eyes glowing in the dark. adding to our fear and desperation. But suddenly, the noise behind us began to fade. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the creature slowing down, as if it had lost our trail. We kept running, though our legs were beginning to give way from exhaustion. It seemed that luck had finally turned in our favor. Unexpectedly, we stumbled upon the entrance to a cave. We didn't understand how we had found it, but there was no other choice. I gestured to the tourists towards the cave, and we ran inside without hesitation. Inside it was dark and damp, the air filled with the smell of mold and earth. I quickly looked around, trying to figure out where we were. The cave was spacious enough to hide from our pursuer, but its narrow passages gave the impression of a trap. I listened. The sounds of pursuit outside the cave had died down. We, breathing heavily, pressed against the walls, trying to be as quiet as possible. In the dim light of the flashlight, I saw the faces of the tourists. They were pale and terrified, but alive. The cave was silent, broken only by our breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. I tried to gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. We were safe for now, but not for long. The werewolf could find us by smell or sound at any moment. "We need to explore the cave," I whispered, trying to instill confidence in my companions. We began to move slowly forward, deeper into the cave. The flashlight beam picked out strange shapes of stalactites and stalagmites from the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We continued further, and the cave gradually widened. Suddenly, a large space opened before us, a natural hall illuminated by faint light seeping through cracks in the ceiling. In the center of this hall was something that made our hearts stop. We continued deeper into the cave and soon came upon another ominous sight. On the walls and floor of the cave, we found numerous red crystals glowing with a dim, sinister light. Around the crystals were large piles of red powder, the same as we had seen before. But the most terrifying sight awaited us ahead. In the center of the large hall lay human skeletons, piles of bones covered in old gear and personal belongings. Rusty compasses, torn backpacks, broken flashlights. All this was here in this grim place. My heart froze with horror as I realized that these could be the very people who had gone missing and were never found. We stood in shock, realizing that this place had become the final refuge for many unfortunate souls. I felt a cold sweat running down my back and a lump of anxiety in my throat. Thoughts raced through my mind about what terrible creature could have committed such atrocities. I began to carefully examine the walls of the cave and suddenly noticed ancient rock paintings on one of them. They were done in red and black tones, clearly different from anything I had ever seen. The first painting depicted a creature resembling a werewolf, surrounded by people in robes. They held their hands up to the sky as if summoning it. Around the creature were drawn circles and symbols similar to those we had seen in the ritual circles. The second painting showed the creature attacking people, tearing them apart. Around it was the same group of people in robes, but now they looked more evil and cruel. It seemed that they controlled the creature, directing its wrath at their victims. The third painting depicted a large stone or altar with a human body lying on it. Around the altar stood people in robes conducting a ritual. Red lines emanated from the body, leading to the creature, which was becoming more powerful and fierce. The fourth painting showed the creature being sealed in the cave. The people in robes standing around it seemed to be using their powers to trap it inside. The symbols on the walls and red crystals were clearly part of this ancient ritual. I realized that this cave was not just the werewolf's lair, but also the place of its summoning and imprisonment. The people in robes were likely ancient cultists who used magical powers to control the creature. and the crystals and powder were part of the rituals associated with it. We continued deeper into the cave, and suddenly a hall illuminated by a mysterious red light opened before us. In the center of the hall was a huge red crystal, inside which a cocoon was visible. The cocoon contained a creature resembling a werewolf. Its form was unclear, but it was evident that this was the source of the monster's power and evolution. These crystals were likely what gave the creature its terrifying strength and form. We stood in silence, stunned by what we saw, when suddenly a loud roar echoed from outside. The werewolf had found us, and the sounds of its approach grew louder. My heart froze, realizing this could be our end. In a panic, I began looking for a way out, running around the cave and inspecting every corner. In one corner, I noticed a recess through which water flowed. It was a narrow passage leading deeper into the cave, and the flowing water suggested it might lead us outside. "Quick, this way!" I shouted, pointing to the recess. The tourists ran to me, and we started descending the narrow passage following the flow of water. This was our only chance for salvation. The passage was narrow and dark, the water cold and swift. We moved forward, slipping and clinging to the walls. The werewolf continued to roar and approach, but the sounds grew fainter as we descended. We didn't know where the passage led, but we had no other choice. We made our way through the narrow tunnel, the water growing stronger, and at times we had to almost crawl to avoid falling. The passage grew steeper, and we began sliding down with the current. Water splashed in our faces, but adrenaline and fear drove us forward. Suddenly, the tunnel widened, and we emerged into a small underground hall where the water collected into a small lake. We stopped to catch our breath and look around. On the walls of the hall, we noticed glowing symbols similar to those on the crystals. "We must keep going," I said, trying to maintain the group's morale. We started moving again, now more calmly, trying to find a way out of this underground trap. The water led us further, and soon we heard the sound of falling water. The tunnel suddenly ended, and before us was a small waterfall with an exit to the surface visible behind it. This was our chance to escape. One by one, we descended the waterfall and finally found ourselves outside. The forest, lit by the moon, seemed peaceful compared to the horror we had experienced. We were wet and exhausted, but alive. "We made it," I whispered, embracing the rescued tourists. The werewolf was somewhere behind, and now we had a chance to return to civilization and report what had happened. The story of the monster in the forest would stay with us forever. But now we knew the truth, and were determined to do everything to ensure that no one else would fall victim to this horror. Story 2. We were slowly moving down Greenview Street, passing by the cozy little houses that adorned this small town. Behind the wheel of our car was Sheriff Tom Harding, my boss. He was lost in his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the road, and nothing could distract him. I had only recently arrived in Elmwood, and my first day in this new place was memorable thanks to meeting Tom. Back then, this 45-year-old man with a beard reached out his hand, smiled warmly, and shook mine like a fatherly figure. Without hesitation, he appointed me as his deputy, and we immediately got down to fulfilling our duties. Elmwood turned out to be so small that it could be called more of a large village than a town. Located on the edge of a vast forest at the foot of a majestic mountain range, it was an oasis of tranquility and safety. Crime here was rare, and the tight-knit and friendly community of residents created an atmosphere of cozy neighborliness, where everyone knew each other by name. Leaving behind the cozy neighborhood, our car smoothly rolled onto the highway. Fields surrounded us on both sides, stretching to the horizon, creating a sense of boundless freedom and space. Golden and green waves of grain swayed under the gentle summer breeze, like the sea under the soft caress of the wind. In the distance, against the blue sky, rose the silhouettes of mountains, lending grandeur and completeness to the landscape. As we progressed along the highway, we left behind the hustle and bustle of the town, immersing ourselves in the tranquility and peace that only nature can provide. Soon, a farm began to loom on the horizon, becoming clearer with each mile we passed. When we arrived, we were greeted by a well-maintained piece of land where picturesque landscapes and hard-working human labor harmoniously coexisted. Miller's farm was an example of rural idyll. A majestic two-story house with white walls and a red roof proudly stood against the backdrop of green fields, while nearby were neat outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop, and a cattle shed. Flower beds were arranged around the house, adding colorful accents to the overall picture, and rows of neatly trimmed shrubs adorned the paths leading to the house. In the backyard, a small lake was visible, adorned with a gazebo, the perfect place for family relaxation. As we approached the house, the sounds of life on the farm became clearer. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and even the distant mooing of a cow created a cozy atmosphere. We parked the car at the porch, and as we got out, we headed towards the front door of the house. Climbing the creaky steps of the porch, we went upstairs and knocked on the door, expecting to meet the owners of this beautiful place. Soon the door opened, and a woman in her 50s appeared on the threshold. Her hair, interspersed with silver threads, was neatly gathered into a bun. Her face, with soft wrinkles around her eyes and lips, expressed kindness and hospitality. She was dressed in a simple but neat dress, adorned with an apron. Recognizing us, she warmly greeted us, and then turned and loudly called out inside the house, inviting her husband. In a moment, a man of about 55 appeared before us. His posture exuded strength and confidence, typical of someone who has spent most of their life outdoors. His face was adorned with a neatly trimmed beard of gray hair, and his gaze was penetrating and friendly. He wore a worn-out flannel shirt and jeans. "Hello, Tom," he greeted the sheriff. Then he shook his hand, after which he looked at me and said, "And this must be your new deputy. Hello, my name is John." He extended his hand, which I shook. "My name is Michael," I replied, to which the old man nodded. Then he casually turned to the sheriff. "How are things in town?" "Everything was quiet until an old ruin disturbed me. Tell me what happened to you." The sheriff replied with a smile. "You know, I wouldn't have bothered you if it weren't for something serious. My best cow has gone missing. She used to give me up to 13 gallons of milk a day. It's such a pity she's gone. A big loss for us," the owner said with sadness in his voice. After a short pause, he added, "Well, let me show you where it happened." After his words, the farm owner led us to the spacious pen where about 50 cows grazed. Approaching the wooden fence, he pointed to the spot where the ground was disturbed, forming numerous tracks, and one of the fence beams was clearly damaged. "I suspect the thief got through this gap. In the summer, I leave the cows overnight in this pen. It's always been quiet here, and I've never worried about their safety. But look at this," John said, pointing to the damage. "Despite the break, I can't understand how someone could have taken such a large cow through this fence. The locks on the gates weren't tampered with, and if it were wild animals, there would be blood stains. But I found nothing like that." We carefully examined the scene of the incident, but it was impossible to determine who left these tracks. The ground was simply churned up, leaving no distinct shapes. After that, we conducted a survey of the area. Walking around the fence, we began to search for clues beyond its limits, but we couldn't find anything suspicious. In search of evidence, we decided to split up to cover more ground. The pen was located near the forest, and I headed towards the dense greenery, hoping to find some traces there. Soon my search was interrupted by Sheriff Harding's voice, calling out to me and waving his hand to beckon me over. Approaching closer, I noticed that his attention was focused on the ground. Bending down over the earth, Sheriff Harding carefully examined a huge footprint. Despite its blurry outlines, the print bore a striking resemblance to a human one, except for its abnormal size, about 15 inches in length. I, struck by such a sight, couldn't take my eyes off it, trying to understand how and who could have left it here. Meanwhile, the sheriff remained calm and focused, as if encountering such a thing was not new to him. He pulled out his smartphone and began to meticulously photograph the footprint from different angles, then took out a ruler and measured it. 15.5 inches, he muttered to himself, carefully jotting down the data in his notebook. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked him what creature could have left such a footprint. The sheriff looked up at me and replied with a hint of skepticism in his voice. "It's not certain yet that it's a creature. There are plenty of pranksters in our country capable of such things, so it's too early to draw any conclusions." I nodded in agreement. Continuing our search for some time, we still couldn't find any additional evidence or clues that could shed light on the disappearance of the miller's cow. Feeling the weight of the moment, we returned to the farm to inform the Millers of the current status of the investigation. With sadness, but also understanding that everything possible had been done, we assured them that we would continue the search. The Millers thanked us for our efforts, despite the lack of results. Then we headed to the neighboring farm, hoping that its inhabitants might have noticed something unusual or suspicious. However, after a series of questions, it became clear that nothing had been observed there that could be related to our case. The farm residents answered us in the negative, not hiding their surprise at what had happened. With this new information, but without additional evidence, we returned to the station. The journey back was filled with reflections on what other steps could be taken to solve this mystery. At the station, we had work to do in organizing the collected data and planning further actions. So passed the remainder of the day. I was awakened by the ringing of the phone. On the other end of the line was Sheriff Harding. His voice was subdued, but urgency was evident. "Get dressed and head to the address I'm sending you right now." Glancing at the clock, I saw that it was only 5 in the morning. Approaching the window, I noticed how the sky was slowly brightening, heralding a new day. Without delay, I quickly washed my face and dressed, trying to gather my thoughts and imagine what could require our attention so early. Starting the car, I headed to the address provided by the sheriff. Upon arrival, I found myself in front of a small house, cozily situated on the edge of the forest. It was a one-story building with wooden walls. The roof of the house was covered with shingles, some of which were moss-covered, indicating many years of its life next to the forest. Around the house, there was a small but well-kept garden. As I arrived, I saw that Sheriff Harding had also just arrived. He was slowly getting out of his patrol car parked nearby. His figure stood out against the morning light, beginning to filter through the dense foliage of the forest. As I stepped out of my car, he nodded towards the door. There stood a woman and a man. She was clearly distraught, crying while he tried to comfort her, embracing her shoulders. Approaching them, we became witnesses to their distress. The woman, barely noticing us, rushed towards us and pleaded anxiously, "Please find Bill." Sheriff Harding tried to reassure her. "Ma'am, please explain everything step by step. We're here to help you." She carefully wiped away her tears and, stuttering with excitement, began to explain. "I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know. Maybe it was a premonition or something, but I couldn't sleep. I went out of my bedroom and decided to check on Bill, but when I looked into his room, he wasn't there. I panicked immediately and started looking for him, but he wasn't in the house. Together with Josh, we searched the entire house and yard, then expanded the search to the surroundings, but Bill was nowhere to be found." As she said this, tears overwhelmed her again. Sheriff Harding, displaying patience, gave her some time to calm down a bit before asking the next question. "Ma'am, was the front door locked? Did you check?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then shook her head, admitting, "No, it seems it wasn't locked." The sheriff and I exchanged glances, then asked for permission to inspect the house. After examining the boy's bedroom and the front door, we concluded that there were no signs of forced entry. Informing the parents of this, we speculated that Bill might have left the house on his own and gotten lost. We considered this initial version the most likely, and decided not to mention the possibility of abduction to avoid worsening the parents' anxiety further. After realizing the scale of the problem, we contacted the precinct requesting assistance. We also reached out to neighbors, quickly forming a search party to meticulously comb the surroundings. Starting our search near the house at the edge of the forest, I stumbled upon a child's toy. It seemed to have been forgotten in haste or dropped in flight. Summoning Sheriff Harding, we inspected the nearby area together and soon stumbled upon a trail that couldn't go unnoticed. It was again that same enormous footprint we had seen before. The sheriff, upon seeing it, froze for a moment, then squatted beside it, lighting a cigarette, lost in thought. After a short pause, he stood up and, addressing me, instructed to document the find. Then, as if deciding something for himself, he plunged into the woods. I carefully documented the location of the toy and the footprint, taking photographs and notes in my notebook. Thoughts of what could have happened to Bill and what creature left this track haunted me. After about 20 minutes, Sheriff Harding returned from the woods, looking pensive. After a brief pause, as if gathering his thoughts, he shook himself and motioned for me to come closer. Issuing orders for the remaining colleagues to continue the search, he and I got into the patrol car and headed in a direction unknown to me. When I asked where we were going, the sheriff replied that we needed to visit someone. I didn't fully understand how this was related to our current investigation, but I nodded in understanding and decided not to ask unnecessary questions. Apparently, the sheriff had in mind someone who could help us find the missing boy or shed light on the mysterious tracks we had discovered earlier. We drove along a road running alongside dense forest. With each miles, the trees seemed denser, their branches sometimes arching over the road, creating the illusion of a tunnel pierced by the rays of the morning sun. The forest filled the air with freshness and subtle scents of earth and vegetation, particularly noticeable in the early hours of the day. Suddenly, the sheriff turned onto a narrow dirt road leading us deeper into the woods. The road wound its way between the trees, and with each turn, it seemed we were delving further into the Green Kingdom. After driving about half a mile along this almost forgotten trail, we approached a house nestled amidst the forest. The house was entirely ordinary, as much as possible in such a secluded place. It was a single-story building with a low roof covered in dark brown tiles, which blended well with the surrounding nature. The walls of the house were painted in a serene shade, which had peeled off in places, showing signs of time and weathering. Around the house sprawled a small plot of land adorned with wildflowers and grasses, lending the place a special secluded coziness. In front of the house, engulfed in the greenery of the forest, we were greeted by a man in jeans and no shirt, busy chopping wood. Next to him stood an old pickup truck from which loud rock music blared, filling the surrounding space with energy and rhythm. Despite our arrival, the man showed no interest and continued his work, as if we were mere shadows on his land. After we parked the car and got out, we stood at a distance, not wanting to intrude on his personal space, and waited. Minutes passed slowly until the man finished his work. Noticing us, he approached the pickup truck and turned off the music, thus interrupting the stream of sounds that had filled the air until then. After a short moment of silence, Chris addressed us. "Sheriff Harding, what do I owe the pleasure of your attention?" "Hello, Chris," replied the sheriff, his tone serious but friendly. "We need your help. It's urgent." Chris, slightly surprised by such an address, responded, "Help, you say? But as you can see, I'm busy," waving his hand towards the chopped wood. "This concerns the disappearance of a child, and it perhaps involves it," continued the sheriff, as if choosing each word carefully. The sheriff's words made Chris flinch, and he asked questioningly, "Sasquatch?" To which the sheriff nodded. This confirmation instantly changed Chris's attitude towards the conversation. His interest clearly piqued and excited by the news, he said, "Well, why didn't you say so right away? Come in." And he led us into the house. As we stepped inside, I was greatly astonished. The walls were adorned with various trophies, from huge deer and bears to more exotic ones, as if taken from the pages of books about unknown creatures. Among them were replicas of stuffed mythical beasts, each with its own plaque. In addition to the trophies, the walls were adorned with antique maps and photographs from his numerous expeditions, where Chris was captured in various corners of the world, from snowy mountains to dense tropical forests. On the shelves were books on cryptozoology, scientific papers, and hunting magazines, as well as collections of rare minerals and artifacts found during his travels. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table cluttered with maps, compasses, night vision cameras, and other equipment for exploring the unknown. On one of the shelves, attention was drawn to a meticulously crafted model of Bigfoot, surrounded by Chris's notes and records about presumed places of its habitat. After Sheriff Harding shared the details of our investigation with Chris and showed him photographs of the huge footprints, the hunter paused for a moment, studying the images with a serious expression. His gaze kept shifting between the photos and the sheriff, as if he was trying to piece together all the details of the story in his mind. Finally, he spoke up. "We might have to spend a few days in the woods, so we'll need to pack supplies and a tent." Upon hearing these words, Chris immediately began gathering supplies. He moved around the house with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he needs. First, he went to the pantry, from where he brought several packets of dried food, bottles of water, and other necessary provisions for survival in the wilderness. Then he headed to the gear closet, where sleeping bags, a camping stove, flashlights, batteries, and a multitude of other items essential for extended stays in the forest were stored. Chris also didn't forget about safety. He took a first aid kit, a map of the area, and a compass, as well as his reliable hunting rifle in case of encounters with wild animals. He carefully packed all of this into a large backpack and additional bags. Once Chris finished preparing, he meticulously loaded all the necessary supplies and equipment into our car. With everything now on board, we were fully prepared for the upcoming expedition into the depths of the forest. Arriving at the house where the child went missing, we found that the search efforts were still ongoing. Officer Harris approached us, informing that there were still no positive results. Sheriff Harding, seemingly prepared for such news, nodded as if expecting such an outcome. He explained to the officer that we were going into the woods for a couple of days of search and instructed them not to cease the search operation around the house and to keep us updated with any news. Then we headed towards the edge of the forest where the track left by the unidentified creature was found. Chris squatted beside the track, beginning to study it carefully. He looked for any signs that could help us understand the creature's direction of movement or behavior. After a brief analysis, we entered the forest, ready for extensive searching. As we made our way through dense vegetation, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. Chris, leading our small group, tirelessly scrutinized the surroundings, searching for any signs of the cryptid's presence. He seemed completely absorbed in the search process, his eyes not missing the slightest detail. The biggest challenge in detecting cryptids is that they can either erase their tracks or simply don't leave any. Chris mused aloud, peering into the shadows between the trees. I don't know if it's their natural or supernatural ability, but following their tracks is extremely difficult. But the one we're following did leave some clues. His words added a sense of mystique and uncharted territory to our journey. Soon, our persistence was rewarded. We discovered a second clear track left by the creature. It was as gigantic as the previous one, and unmistakably indicated that we were moving in the right direction. As we trudged through the forest, our path occasionally led us to clearings bathed in bright sunlight, and then into thickets of dense shrubbery where sunlight barely penetrated through the dense canopy of trees. The forest trail meandered, constantly forcing us to adjust our direction based on the tracks found. Chris, leading our small group, carefully scanned the surroundings for new evidence. At one point, we veered off course and had to backtrack after realizing our mistake. Soon, our path led us to another obvious trace left by the creature. It confirmed that we were heading in the right direction. However, our progress was suddenly halted by an unpleasant discovery. On one of the forest clearings, we found the carcass of a dead bear. The animal lay on the ground, its head missing. It had been severed with such force and precision that it instantly sent shivers down our spines. There were no signs of struggle or other traces around the carcass. Everything looked as if the attack had occurred suddenly. We stopped to examine the scene. Chris cautiously circled the bear's carcass, trying to find any clues that could help us understand what had happened. The heavy stench of death hung in the air, mixing with the natural scents of the forest, creating a strange and unsettling feeling. I still couldn't believe what was happening. At first, it seemed to me that it was all not serious, and the sheriff might be looking for imitators of this creature. But seeing this carcass made me feel uneasy, and doubts began to creep into my mind. After a thorough examination of the bear's carcass, we continued our journey deeper into the forest. The sun began to slowly descend towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, heralding the onset of evening. Realizing that daylight was coming to an end, we began to look for a suitable place to camp for the night. Soon we found an open patch of land that was perfect for setting up camp. This spot was fairly level and situated on a rise, providing good visibility of the surrounding area and protection from potential runoff. Without delay, we pitched our tent, creating a cozy shelter for the night. Then we gathered twigs and dry branches for a campfire. As darkness fell, the fire crackled to life, casting a warm light on our tired faces and creating a sense of coziness and safety amidst the vast forest. Several stones were arranged around the fire, on which we placed our simple dinners of dry rations and canned food warmed over the flames. Sitting by the fire, we quietly ate our dinners, enjoying the relative calmness and warmth of the fire. Around us, the sounds of the nocturnal forest could be heard. The rustle of leaves, the calls of nocturnal birds, and the distant howling of wolves. Sitting by the fire, enveloped in the darkness and silence of the night forest, I decided to learn more about the mysterious creatures that could be lurking in its depths. "How long have you been searching for this creature?" I asked Chris. For a moment, Chris seemed lost in distant memories before giving an answer. "It started back in childhood," he began. "There were always legends about Bigfoot in our town, and those stories always fascinated me. Once, when I was young and perhaps quite foolish, I decided to venture into the woods in search of it." Chris smiled, reminiscing about his youthful adventure, but his eyes remained serious. "I got lost. They searched for me for a whole week. During that time, I survived in the forest, feeding on berries and nuts. One night, I thought I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was help, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't human. The figure was huge and gray. It seemed to notice me and glanced around. I managed to hide in dense bushes. The creature approached, surveyed the area, but finding nothing, disappeared." His voice sounded tense, recalling that moment of fear and bewilderment. "I sat trembling in the bushes, and after that encounter, I couldn't forget it. They found me, and I told the story, but of course no one believed me." He sighed tiredly and pulled out a flask from his pocket, offering me whiskey. Declining the offer, I watched as he took a few sips and continued. "So when you came to me today and showed the tracks, I was so excited. I've been looking for evidence of their existence for so long, and after all these years, it has manifested itself again." We sat in silence, absorbed in his story. Chris's story ended when suddenly a noise came from the bushes, making us turn sharply. My heart raced faster as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it towards the suspicious sounds. We approached slowly, the piercing light of the flashlight sliding over the bushes until it illuminated something gray and massive hidden among the foliage. For a moment I froze, trying to understand what was before me. As the flashlight rose higher, it revealed a huge, hairy face with fangs, reminiscent of a monkey. The creature met us with the fiery gaze of its eyes and grinned horribly. Instinctively, I reached for my gun, and at that moment the creature swiftly disappeared into the night forest. We chased after it, but it vanished without a trace. Standing in the complete silence of the night forest, I turned to the sheriff and said, trying to contain the tremor in my voice, "Boss, it really exists. It exists." After thoroughly inspecting the surroundings and finding no more clues, we realized that chasing it on such a night was a bad idea. Deciding to wait until morning, we returned to the campfire, but sleep hardly came to me that night. At dawn, we resumed our search. With the first rays of sunlight bathing the forest in its warm light, the events of the night before seemed distant and almost unreal. But the further we progressed along the trail, the clearer it became that we had encountered something inexplicable and very real. Discussing what had happened, we tried to find a logical explanation, but every option seemed unconvincing. Soon we came upon a dense thicket stretching for miles ahead, leading to rocky mountain ridges towering on the horizon. It was clear that our path lay through this thicket, which was so dense that direct sunlight could not penetrate through its thickets, shrouding everything in semi-darkness. We stopped at the entrance to the thicket, looking into its dark depths with a sense of nervousness and fear. this place might not seem so scary if it weren't for yesterday's encounter with the unknown. Fear of the unknown, reinforced by our fresh memories, made us think twice before entering this dark place. Chris told us that he had explored this forest many times before but had never seen this place, which was strange. After exchanging glances one last time, full of determination and readiness for the unknown, we stepped into the dense thicket. The initial silence of the forest instilled a sense of calmness, and we cautiously moved forward, peering into the surrounding nature and anticipating an encounter with the unknown. But soon the atmosphere began to change as we stumbled upon animal skeletons and scattered bones, strangely missing skulls. This detail seemed particularly alarming to me, creating the impression that we were not just in the forest, but in some sinister trap or even a graveyard. Continuing our search, hoping to find any trace of the child, we came across a small boot forgotten amidst tall grass. This discovery suddenly gave us a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the child was still alive and our search was not in vain. However, with each step deeper into the forest, the bones became more numerous, as if we were walking through a silent graveyard of animals, each of which had contributed to this grim landscape. Our attention was drawn to the unpleasant smell of decay, which grew stronger as we approached. Gathering our courage, we headed towards the source of the stench, and soon found a decaying cow carcass among the rocks. The area around it was swarming with flies, whose buzzing created a grim symphony of death. With a high probability, it was Miller's missing cow. Without a word, we left the place, eager to get away from the unbearable stench and the grim thoughts it evoked. We continued our journey, keeping in mind the image of the found boot as a reminder that our search was not over yet. A sense of unease and urgency grew with each step, urging us forward through the dense greenery and the secrets that this ancient forest held. As we ventured further into the forest, in one of the small clearings hidden among the trees, we stumbled upon something resembling a shrine or altar. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone, on which strange symbols and imprints resembling huge footprints were laid out. Surrounding the stone, as if guarding it, were skulls of various sizes, from small animals to those belonging to large mammals. Among them was one object that caught our special interest and awe. A large skull, whose shape resembled that of a human, but its size and some features were so unusual that it could not be attributed to any known species. Along one side of the clearing, long branches and sticks were neatly arranged, forming something akin to a wall or barrier, each of which was wrapped in hairs and fabrics, differing in texture and color from those of the ordinary forest animals. These hairs seemed rough and thick, as if they belonged to a creature whose existence we could only guess at. Next to the altar lay several large stones arranged in a certain order, forming a shape reminiscent of a star or compass. On one of the stones were engraved images depicting silhouettes of creatures similar to what we had seen last night. Hairy, massive figures with sharp fangs. As we carefully examined the altar, trying to decipher the meaning of these mysterious objects, a sudden fierce roar from behind made us turn sharply. But where we expected to see the source of the sound, there was no one. The creature skillfully concealed itself in the dense thicket, leaving us in tension and uncertainty. Instantly drawing our weapons, we tried to remain vigilant when a sharp sound came from the other side. Either the same beast was incredibly fast, or there were several of them. We stood back to back, preparing for a possible attack from any direction. The creature moved with incredible speed, allowing us to see only fleeting silhouettes in the semi-darkness of the forest. Suddenly, huge boulders, threatening to crush us upon impact, began to fly towards us from an unknown direction. Dodging these deadly projectiles became a real challenge. Suddenly, the sheriff opened fire, and without hesitation, we joined in the shooting. But our bullets seemed to either miss the target or be powerless against this creature, which continued to unleash its stone fury upon us. As we tried to dodge, one of the stones struck Chris's arm with such force that the bones were instantly broken and he fell to the ground screaming in pain. We rushed to his aid, helping him up. At that moment, the sheriff shouted, "Run! We need to run!" We ran. The sheriff supported the hunter, and I covered their rear, shooting at the pursuing creature. The shots and cries of the beast merged in the chaos of the chase. As we retreated, I continued to shoot until I noticed that my companions had disappeared from sight. In panic, I began to look around for them when suddenly a powerful blow knocked me off my feet, and I lost consciousness, plunging into dreamless darkness. When I came to, a 6-year-old boy stood over me. It was Bill, the boy we had desperately been searching for. His presence filled me with relief, which quickly turned to bewilderment as I tried to understand where we were. Looking around, I realized that we were in a dungeon, a room with a low ceiling enclosed by a cage made of logs. Peering outside, I understood that we were in a cave, and our cell was just one of its many recesses. On the floor lay the skin of a beast. I looked at the child. He was trembling all over and terrified. Approaching him, I hugged him, trying to reassure him and promising that we would escape, although inside I doubted my words. Calming down, the boy soon fell asleep and I gently laid him on the skin, pondering how long he could have been sleeping in safety. After making sure that Bill was safe, I turned my attention to the grate, trying to find a way to open it. Discovering a mechanism with a peg, I futilely tried to pull it out, realizing that without the right tool, I couldn't manage it. Looking into the depths of the cave, I saw numerous skulls scattered around the room, and in the center, the fresh carcass of a deer. This sight filled the air of the cave with a terrifying atmosphere. Suddenly, the creature entered the cave, huge, covered in gray fur. Its heavy breathing filled the space as it approached the deer carcass, tore off its leg, and began to chew on the raw meat. Noticing us, the creature glanced in our direction. I held my breath as it approached our cage. I stepped back to the other end, trying to keep as much distance between us as possible. The creature looked truly terrifying. Its small eyes stared at me intently, studying. Then, unexpectedly, it threw the remains of the meat through the bars, and then retreated into the depths of the cave. As soon as the creature left the cave, silence fell, giving us hope of rescue. I tried to use this moment to find a way out of the cage, pulling on the bars one by one in search of the weakest link. Despite all efforts, success eluded me until suddenly a noise was heard from outside. To my surprise and relief, the sheriff managed to enter the cave. He gestured for silence and quickly inspected the cage. Seeing the peg, he forcefully knocked it out with his boot, thus opening the door. I quickly grabbed the child, and we cautiously stepped out into the cave. The sheriff waved me to follow him. We silently made our way through the cave, and I couldn't help but look around. Everywhere there was an eerie feeling of abandonment and danger. In one corner, my attention was drawn to the skeletons of people, scattered around the corners of the cave. This sight filled me with fear and realization of how dangerous this creature could be. I understood that we were not just dealing with a myth or legend. Before us was a real threat, capable of horrifying deeds. Navigating through the dark corridors of the cave, we tried to move as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the creature's attention. Every rustle, every unexpected sound made us freeze. But under the sheriff's guidance, who either knew the cave plan well or was just lucky in finding the way out, we continued our quiet progress towards freedom. When we heard distant roars, the sheriff hurriedly urged us not to pay attention and quicken our pace. A shot into the air he fired after his words was probably a signal to Chris, who was distracting the creature from us at that moment. We ran hastily. The cave was in the mountains, so we had to descend a steep slope before reaching familiar foliage. We didn't look back, trying to cast aside all fears, although the sounds of roars echoed from afar. When I asked the sheriff if we would wait for Chris, he replied that they had agreed to meet near our camp. I nodded and we continued to run, not looking back, afraid that the creature might be following us. This continued until we reached our camp, where we spent the night. Stopping, we began to wait for Chris. As evening fell, we decided not to light a fire to avoid unnecessary attention. As darkness fell, we grouped together trying to keep warm. Suddenly we heard rustling in the bushes. I instantly drew my pistol, preparing for the worst as the rustling continued, making us strain to peer into the darkness. And suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes. It was Chris. We breathed a sigh of relief and hurried to embrace him, rejoicing at his return. But his gaze was troubled. He kept looking back. With a worried expression, he said that we needed to leave urgently. His words filled the air with a sense of urgency, and we quickly gathered our belongings, preparing for further escape from the threat that still seemed to lurk in the shadows of the night forest. In the dark of the night forest, it seemed as if nature itself held its breath, awaiting the outcome of our mad escape. The sheriff, Chris, and I, with Bill in my arms, dashed through the darkness, carving a path between the trees, whose shadows seemed like huge sentinels of this ominous world. Every step on the soft forest moss seemed to produce sounds louder than thunderclaps, and our hearts beat in unison with the frantic rhythm of the chase. The sounds coming from the depths of the forest filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The roar of a creature born from the very shadows shattered the night, reminding us of the closeness of the danger that sought to engulf us. We didn't know how far this monster was pursuing us, but every rustle behind us made us speed up, as if death itself breathed down our necks. The air was filled with cold and dampness, and the branches of the trees, like dead fingers, tried to grab us, slowing our pace. In the forest, devoid of light, pitch darkness made our imagination paint the most terrifying pictures, giving every shadow the form of our pursuer. Each shot fired by the sheriff into the night in hopes of repelling the creature only heightened the feeling of hopelessness, adding elements of a cruel survival game to our escape. We didn't know if we would manage to escape this unknown threat, but we understood. Stopping meant the end. Making our way through the thicket, experiencing the weight of the night terror, we suddenly saw light ahead. It was a ray of hope in the endless darkness of our despair. Joyfully, we ran towards it, each step bringing us closer to salvation. And soon, before us lay the miller's farm, the very same farm we had visited before. With the sheriff and Chris, despite exhaustion and injuries, we quickly approached the farm. Seeing the familiar paddock, the sheriff leaped over it first, then helped Chris, and finally I handed him the child before jumping over the fence myself. Looking back one last time, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of the trees, staring at us. Indicating to my companions, we all stared at this mysterious entity together. For a moment the world stood still, and we stood facing each other, separated by darkness and uncertainty. Then, the huge figure, whose presence filled us with horror, disappeared into the depths of the forest. With relief, we exhaled, allowing ourselves to take a deep breath for the first time in a long time. The events of this night would stay with us forever, like a heavy dream from which we wanted to wake up. We headed towards the miller's house in search of shelter and rest after the exhausting flight. Looking back one last time at the sinister darkness of the forest, I silently wished myself and my companions that we would never again encounter that creature that tried to engulf us. This forest seemed to hold many secrets, but some of them were better left unsolved.